Now here's Margaret Howard with her pick of the week.
Hello again. Have you heard of buppies? They're black yuppies I discovered this week. What is it to be as black as Newgate's knocker? Stanley Ellis has been finding out. Russell Harty has been in search of medieval monastic hanky-panky in Bavaria, while those of us who stayed at home for the holiday had a lovely wallow in nostalgia. Do you remember this fellow?
I'm a troll, foldy roll. I'm a troll, foldy roll. I'm a troll, foldy roll. Foldy roll, rolly.
The troll with evil designs on the three billy goats gruff. If that's part of your childhood listening, you'll remember Children's Favourites, introduced by Uncle Mac of Children's Hour fame. On Bank Holiday Monday, Jeremy Nicholas took us back to the 50s.
Hello, children everywhere.
The signature tune, Puffin Billy. The voice, Derek McCulloch, Uncle Mac. And every Saturday morning, millions of children tuned into the wireless to listen to records like this.
Nellie the elephant packed her trunk and said goodbye to the circus. Off she went with the trumpety trump, 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 trump.
And this.
Oh, the buzzing of the bees and the cigarette trees, the soda water fountain, where the lemonade springs and the bluebird sings in that big rock candy mountain.
And this.
The railroad comes through the middle of the house. The railroad comes through the middle of the house. The trains all come through the middle of the house since the company bought the land.
And this.
Sing your song, Mr. Cuckoo.
Let us hear your welcome voice, let the countryside rejoice.
Sing away, bright and gay, Mr. Cuckoo.
When it's cuckoo time, it's time to fall in love.
Children's Favourites, or Children's Choice as it was called originally, was the first regular national record request programme for children. Teenagers hadn't been invented then.
And one of the children, now grown up, who was lucky enough to get a request played, was Rod Hackney, princely advisor and president of the Royal Institute of British Architects.
It was a ritual. You set your clock, your weekly clock by it, and you had to get up at a certain time. Our family tended to sleep in a weekend, and I was the first up to listen to Uncle Mac. It was there was a slot for you then, and my mother expected me to be there. She knew where I was. And I got the use of the kitchen for that period while other people were still in bed, you see. It seemed to be one of the programmes on radio that didn't talk down to children. That was its greatest strength. You felt this man had some sort of respect for the audience. You're an equal, you have a right to request. And I remember, I think I might have had one or even two requests at the time. I must have been around 9 or 10, I think, that sort of age. But I remember one was a four-legged friend. That was on, I think, every Saturday. And when they gave out the names and addresses of those who requested it, it used to go on and on and on.
Can you remember who sang it?
Yes, now, I remember the tune very much. Four-legged friend, a four-legged friend.
He'll never let you down. He's honest and faithful right up to the end. That wonderful 1, 2, 3, four-legged friend.
Roy Rogers, without Trigger, and perhaps not surprisingly without his wife Dale.
Jeremy Nicholas recalling Children's Favourites. Alas, children these days are too sophisticated to enjoy such simple pleasures, or perhaps too intelligent to waste their time on such trivia. Judging by 5-year-old Oliver Smith, kids are getting brighter by the minute. Oliver does listen to the radio, but his favourite programme is Science on 4. He's interested in space, and he bombards SO4 with scientific inquiries. Peter Evans was so impressed by his questions that he invited young Oliver into the studio to put them directly to a theoretical physicist, Professor John Taylor.
Please, can you tell me what's outside the universe?
Well, there you go, John Taylor. What's outside the universe? It's always, the younger you are, the more awkward the questions you ask, isn't it?
Yes, it's a very awkward question. I think I have to admit defeat. I can't tell you what's outside the universe. Because if I could tell you, I'd have had to be able to detect it, to see it. I'd have had to use light to see it with. And therefore, it would have been part of the universe. So really, outside the universe is nothing we can ever know about. I couldn't say it's nothing, because to say it is nothing outside the universe, I'd have to know about that. And to know about it, I'd have to go and see.
Let me just interrupt you there, John. Oliver, what do you think lies outside the universe?
Another universe.
Another universe? And then what's outside that one, then?
Another one.
So it just goes on and on?
Mm.
Because that is actually a rather profound thing to say, isn't it, John Taylor? Because people have often looked at this notion of the infinite Russian dull series of universes.
There are ideas, of course, that there are many universes. Our universe is constantly branching into different branches. But the problem about that sort of idea, as I tried to say to Oliver, is that we can never really test them.
5-year-old Oliver Smith, who has an IQ of 155, flooring the experts on Science on 4. Sir Peter Pears was a bright child too. His life was recalled in his own words and in the voices of family and friends in a Radio 3 profile presented by Michael Barclay. It's 2 years since Peter Pears died at the age of 75. His fine tenor voice is, of course, most closely associated with the music of Benjamin Britten, his lifelong companion. But music wasn't his only love, as his niece Susan Pears Phipps revealed while talking about the Pears family background.
His father was a civil engineer, and as he said, he really never saw him. He was always away from home. And he lived with his mother, very much the youngest of the family. I think there were 7 of them. Only 5 reached adulthood. But I think it explains quite a lot about him that he was with his mother alone, really all his childhood. Absolutely adored her, and very much resented the intrusion, as he felt it, of his father when he came home from time to time, and confessed to being absolutely loathsome to his father. He often, in his later days, used to almost break down from time to time and say, I did such terrible things to my father. I never made him welcome. I thrust him out of the house. It was dreadful. And it was on his conscience very badly.
What was family life like, do you think?
Well, they didn't have much of a home. Even he and his mother, they were on the move the whole time, and his home was probably largely at school. Fortunately for him, he absolutely adored school. And when other people were always looking forward to going home, he was dreading the idea of the holidays coming, just wanted to stay at school, which he very often did for a good deal of the time. So he was one of those exceptions, a child who didn't have much home life and was terribly happy.
Cricket and music seemed to be the main preoccupations in those early days, and very much in that order, as Pears himself once told me.
I started playing a piano when I was 5, inspired by a cousin's playing of the Minute Waltz of Chopin, I think. That I remember very well. And in memory, I feel as I sat down and played it immediately at once, but I don't think I can quite have done that.
I remember reading that one of your school chums remembers you not so much for music, but for cricket.
Well, of course, the great moment of my life, I mean far greater than singing at the Met, was when I played at the Oval for the young amateurs of Sussex against the young amateurs of Surrey, and went in last. Indeed, I went in number 13 because we were playing 13 aside, and I made far and away the biggest score of my life, which was 81 not out. And the thrill of running up the stairs of the pavilion at the Oval, you know, and taking my cap off and waving my bat at the applauding multitude was certainly the greatest experience I've ever had.
Lancing College was clearly a great success for Pears, though an organ scholarship to Hertford College, Oxford, seems to have been a less happy experience, due perhaps to a shortage of funds. After only a year at Oxford, Pears returned to teach classics, music and games at his old prep school, The Grange, in Crowborough in East Sussex. 4 years of teaching only served to convince Pears that he should apply himself fully to becoming a singer, and he went to the Royal College of Music for 2 terms to study with Dawson Freer, who a few years earlier had also taught Joan Cross.
I left the college in 34, and I was at the BBC Singers for the next 2 years. I was doing quite a bit of work, really, one way or another, and I did an occasional broadcast, I did an occasional recording. I recorded an earlier work of Peter Warlock,
Yes, I think it was your first record.
That was my
actually,
first
78,
record,
yeah.
yes.
A quick snatch from an old recording by Peter Pears of Peter Warlock's Corpus Christi Carol. Poetry Please for the Easter holiday gave itself over to poems for children. Kit Wright, who's presenting the programmes at the moment, read one of his own, a moral tale on the subject of pride.
Two birds sat in a big white bra that swung as it hung on the washing line. They sang hooray and they sang hurrah. Of all the birds, we're the best by far. Our hammock swings to the highest star. No life like yours and mine. They were overheard by a third bird that swooped down onto a nearby tree and sneered, "Knickers, it's plain to see a bird in a tree is worth two in a bra. There's no bird half so fine." And it seemed indeed that he was right, for the washing line was far too tight and old and frayed. As the laundry flapped, the big wind heaved and the rope snapped. You should have heard the third bird. He cried, "Aha!" For all their chatter and la-di-da, they didn't get far in their big white bra. If there is a bird who's a superstar, it's me, it's me, it's me. Down to the ground he dived in his glee, and the big black cat enjoyed his tea. I once acted as an emergency substitute judge at a verse-speaking competition and heard 17 consecutive renditions of our next request by small performers. It never put me off the piece, and I thought the fact that not one of these offerings was actually bad was a powerful tribute to the construction of the poem. Alfred Noyes, who wrote it, seems to me an excellent poet, though nowadays known only for the highwaymen come down to Kew in lilac time, and this one, Daddy Fell into the Pond. Michael Cray of Sheffield has asked for it for his sons.
Everyone grumbled. The sky was grey. We had nothing to do and nothing to say. We were nearing the end of a dismal day, and there seemed to be nothing beyond. Then Daddy fell into the pond. And everyone's face grew merry and bright, and Timothy danced for sheer delight. "Give me the camera, quick, oh quick! He's crawling out of the duckweed!" Click! Then the gardener suddenly slapped his knee and doubled up, shaking silently, and the ducks all quacked as if they were daft, and it sounded as if the old drake laughed. Oh, there wasn't a thing that didn't respond when Daddy fell into the pond.
Elizabeth Proud reading Daddy Fell into the Pond by Alfred Noyes. 20 years ago, on the 4th of April 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated. He was only 39 years old, but in his lifetime he'd become an inspirational figure. His powerful vision of what life could and should be like for black Americans was expressed in ringing evangelical tones. His speeches are now part of the fabric of the history of the 20th century, with their recurring plea that men and women should not be judged by the colour of their skin. Radio 1's tribute to Dr. King was a piece of electronic wizardry composed by Richard Attry of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. It presented a dramatic reconstruction in sound and music of the events of the life of a man who preached peace, but who inevitably provoked violence.
We have information that King has been shot. We can't place the attack here. We have information King has been shot at Lorraine. We can't place the attack here. We have information that King has been shot at the Lorraine.
I have a dream this afternoon. I have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream. I have a dream this afternoon. I have a dream.
this afternoon I have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream. I have a dream. I have a dream.
Part of The Dream, composed by Richard Attry, broadcast on Radio 1. For Radio 4, Sally Hardcastle went to America to find out how much of Martin Luther King's dream had become a reality. She visited several cities with black communities to see if they could truly say that they are now free at last. In Chicago, she consulted Studs Terkel, the writer and broadcaster and veteran observer of society.
Since the civil rights revolution of the 60s, something happened to the consciousness of black people. There's a strong, very unified black community in Chicago. Its consciousness is strong, but economically it's in awful shape. There are the few blacks who've made it, the middle-class blacks, and there are those, and they're doing rather well. They're the token blacks in the companies, in executive positions. And it's a young black group called puppies. You've heard that phrase.
No, I haven't heard
Black yuppies, you see. But they are a minority, you see. The great many blacks, of course, are suffering. The gap between white and black today, any form of any kind of statistic will show you, is wider than it was. The black personally might be slightly better off than he was prior to the 60s. But even there, it's a question. So you must remember what's happened with the nature of jobs themselves changing, with an industrial society, less steel mills, the closing of steel mills for reasons we needn't go into. So blacks lost packing house jobs, no packing houses in Chicago, steel jobs, farm equipment jobs. People generally are working, but among the blacks, the effect is devastating.
Martin Luther King's own children have grown up into an unusual position. For them personally, equality is no longer an issue, but a large part of their lives is dedicated to working at the Martin Luther King Center in Atlanta, founded in their father's memory to further his work. They have their own careers too. At 32, Yolanda King is the eldest. She helps to run a theatre company, and she's clearly always had an eye to showbiz, as she revealed while talking about her daddy to Gordon Clough. Daddy wasn't at home as much as his daughter would have liked. His work for the civil rights movement kept him very busy, and sometimes landed him in jail.
There was an amusement park in Atlanta called Funtown, and I was an amusement park fanatic as a kid. In fact, my father would come out of jail. In fact, we had an annual trip to an amusement park. He came out of jail once to take me to this particular amusement park. But Funtown was a park that was not open to black people. Yet it was advertised on television, and I couldn't understand if it was on television, why couldn't we go? It was when Mother said to me, "Your father is going to jail so that you can go to Funtown." That's when I understood. I said, oh, well, he can't be a bad man then. Unlike the images, of course, that the kids were teasing me and perpetuating in my mind. But I was in my late teens before I can really honestly say I understood Martin Luther King Jr. and the scope of what he was doing.
You know, my father died a little bit longer ago than yours, but not very much. And I think of him quite a lot. But you obviously have to think of yours every day. I mean, you're absolutely surrounded by him. You walk down the street, there's the Martin Luther King this or Martin Luther King, and the whole work is about it. But I just wonder whether you actually remember him.
Oh, yeah, very much. Well, I was 12, and my father and I were buddies. The times that we shared, we spent laughing, playing. He taught me to swim when I was 4 years old. One of my favorite activities in life was when he'd come home, he'd put me on top of the refrigerator, and I'd jump into his arms. And I was so hurt when I got too big to do it, and my sister still could, you know. My memories are very, very strong. He told me about the birds and the bees. And I'm so thankful when I look back that he had that kind of insight and wisdom and courage during that time to sit down with his two eldest children and share that particular experience with them. Most of my peers learned it from their peers, and they learned from each other. I had the opportunity to hear from my parents, and my memories are very, very vivid.
If he were to be able to speak to you now directly and assess the work that's been done so far, Would he be pleased with the progress that's been made since he died? Would he be pleased with the work that the four of you and your mother have been able to do in the time since he died?
Well, I certainly hope that he would be pleased with what we have done. I know he would be pleased with what my mother's done, because she didn't have to. It would have been so easy to just retire into a private life and remarry and raise us and not have the overwhelming responsibilities that she has. But I think he would be very, very disappointed about where we are as a world, that there are more people who are suffering, who are starving, who have no hope of any kind of dignity in their life, that racism is still constitutionally established in a part of this world. He would be tremendously disappointed, I think.
Yolanda King talking about her late father, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Russell Harty continued to bumble his way across Europe on his BBC Two Grand Tour. Germany he greeted with all the reservation instilled into him by Granny Harty, who used to warn him of the dangers of Adolf Hitler while tucking young Russell up in bed at night. He was soon able to put that behind him, though, and with the help of John Wells got stuck into the beer and the bratwurst, not to say the cultural heritage of Germany's east and west. After interviewing a cloistered nun, he headed for Bavaria in search of some merry medieval sinners whose monastic caperings have since reached the ears of the wider world.
I'm driving west through Bavaria to find a monastery here called Benedictborn, because it has a guilty and a venal history. A collection of songs and poems were written here in the 13th century. Songs about God's blessings and the joys of spring, but also about drink and gluttony and sex, a positive explosion of carnal delights and erotic fantasies. All things which cloistered monks were not supposed to know about, let alone privately celebrate. They were discovered in the library in 1803, and the authorities kept the lid firmly on them. Then, in 1930, the composer Carl Orff cleaned them up, set them to jolly music, and published them. And now the songs are a popular offering of any self-respecting choral society. They are called Carmina Burana. My suspicions about the worldliness of this community were further aroused when I was greeted by Father Weber, the head of the house, in a dapper suit. I had not expected such a cheerful welcome, me with my little bag of prurient questions, and curious to know how he would deal with the distant rattling of an ecclesiastical skeleton in the cupboard. The worldly wisdom of this man can cope with those who have prying noses. But it's a very strange collection, isn't it?
A very different collection. Collection.
There are all sorts of different kinds of songs in it, some of them extremely.
But certainly, but there are about 5 parts. And the greatest part of this is as a collection of songs for springtime and love.
But some of them are really rather rude and strange, I don't know.
But there are also strange texts, and therefore I am sure the Benedictine monks hold secret this manuscript intentionally, because they couldn't identify themselves with a part of the text from this collection.
Because it would incriminate them.
Yes, for in this time certainly. But these 3 texts are also a witness of the free life in the Middle Ages.
Absolutely. But you see, it's possible that anybody can look as though they're enjoying the life of a monastery. I mean, you look at you, yourself. You don't look like a monk. You look like a manager of a bank. You do.
Well, why? It must not be that a priest is quietly different from other people. It must be different in his spirit.
In his heart.
In his heart.
In his mind. But outside.
In his character.
Outside doesn't matter.
Yes. That is a modern form of our living, of our life today. But nevertheless, I am a member of a spiritual community. This is a modern form since about 300 years in the church.
Do you enjoy wine?
Of course, of course.
And you enjoy springtime?
Of course.
And I won't ask any other questions.
Russell Harty on his grand tour. Recently on Radio 4, we had a programme about a blind woman who had an operation which restored her sight. This week on BBC One, there was a story of a woman whose hearing was restored as the result of an operation. On QED, Christine Harding first of all described how she went deaf.
13 prison officers at Gloucester Jail have been suspended for failing to turn up for duty at Worcester Crown Court. The Home Secretary
One evening, I was watching the news and doing a spot of ironing.
Gloucester, Swansea and Northampton.
And all of a sudden I realised that the newscaster's voice had changed somewhat.
The immediate crisis in Britain's prisons. Within the last few minutes, we've heard that 2 prisoners have escaped after...
It sounded a bit garbled, almost as though she was talking from underwater. A sort of Mickey Mouse-ish thing, like a diver that's been down too long. So my immediate reaction was that there was something wrong with the batteries or the lead in my hearing aid. And I went upstairs to check. And whilst I was up there, I went to have a chat with my daughter. And was horrified to find that her voice sounded exactly the same. So by that I knew it was nothing to do with the television, it was nothing to do with my hearing aids. And I began to panic and felt that my hearing was on its way out completely. I came downstairs and told my husband what had happened. By then the sound on the television was going on and off almost. There'd be moments when I could hear nothing at all. And it was just a feeling of total, utter panic. And all I could think about was, God, I'm only 40. And this is it.
Generation chemical weapons from America would be...
We went to the hospital and they fitted up a microphone and headphones for me, and the speech therapist was talking into the microphone, and I know that the volume was obviously very, very loud that was going to the headphones, but I just couldn't hear anything at all. They put me on a dose of steroids and inhalation of oxygen to try to sort of blast out any infection that was in my ear. But I knew that it wasn't going to come back. And they said, well, we've known it come back up to 10 weeks after this sort of deafness. But I just knew that that was it. It was finished.
But it wasn't the finish. Although at the beginning it was thought that nothing could be done. Christine just had to get on with it and try to learn to live with deafness. At first she tried to carry on running the shop and post office she and her husband Richard had. But it all proved very difficult. Then they heard about a technical device that might help. A cochlear implant is something like having a radio receiver and transmitter buried underneath your skin. After it's been installed, the doctors have to wait 4 weeks to see if it'll work, and even then they're very cautious. Christine lip reads their final instructions.
Right, Christine, it's the moment you've been waiting for. Paddy has adjusted the speech processor now so that all the sounds you will hear should be at a comfortable level.
Right.
But we haven't spoken to you through the implant yet, and that's what I'm going to do now. You may find that my voice sounds a little strange at first and a bit squeaky, and you may not like the sound you hear. So do remember that it's not going to sound like the voices you remember from before you went deaf. Right. I'll keep talking. I'm turning the volume up slowly. I'll just keep talking in a normal voice.
I can't hear anything.
No. I'm just turning it up very slowly.
Oh, I see.
Because we don't want any...
Got you now.
Good. We don't want any uncomfortable sounds coming through, so I'm being careful. I'll keep turning it up. Tell me when it's coming through nice and clear. Is that coming through a bit louder now?
That
was a bit loud.
It was marvellous.
That was your voice? Right. What does my voice sound like now?
It's most odd to hear my voice. It sounds like a radio, sort of not quite right.
Badly tuned radio?
Yes.
Right, okay. What about the loudness?
Could come up a little bit.
Come up a bit, right. I'm still being careful.
Yeah.
Right, that's a bit louder now.
Yes.
How does that sound?
You've got quite a deep voice, haven't you?
I have, yes.
I
That's
didn't expect
right. Good. Now, would you like to hear Richard say something?
Yes, fine.
Just hold this? Yes, the back isn't on, so you need to be careful. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
Good. Lovely. That's an excellent result.
What does it sound like to you, hearing all our voices now?
Fantastic. Really. It makes such a difference that instead of just your lips moving, that there's something that's going with it.
Christine Harding on QED. BBC One's Mastermind is back on the air. One of the contestants in the programme you can see next Thursday is a man from Oswaldtwistle, Martin Wyatt, who's a statistician. Nothing statistical in his choice of specialist subject, though, the life and stories of Edgar Allan Poe. With a man from their patch on the show, BBC Radio Lancashire reporters Simon Marlowe and Jeremy Dry decided to go with Martin to Leeds University for the rehearsal. The contestants have a chance to practice for that tense moment when they sit for real in that famous black chair to face 2 minutes of questions from Magnus Magnusson. The planning and preparation of the programme is in the hands of the producer, Peter Massey.
It's a year's work in the office, preparing. You see, when you think of it, Magnus has to have available to him for each programme close on 200 questions of both specialist and general knowledge, and it is a long process. Plus, of course, we've got to find the 64 people who are going to take part.
Your general knowledge question starting.
And one.
Now, what is the trial of the Pyx? PYX.
Caption. Caption.
Pass. What are elvers? Young eels. Correct?
When Martin applied, he was one of, I think it was 5,000, and I remembered him well. He impressed me very much at the interview. And I tell you what, one of the things that impressed me, not just the fact that he knew a bit about what he was talking, but he also had a super approach. It's a game. This was his attitude. I'm going to have some fun whatever happens. I'm going to enjoy it. And if somebody actually openly says that to me, they're in with a good chance there, because that's what I'm looking for. It's a pretty concentrated 2 minutes that they go in for, and if before and after they can have a grin and a smile, that counts for a lot, and Martin certainly does that.
What I like about Mastermind is meeting the people who are involved in it. Each program for totally different people, and they're in a state of tension, of their sort of heightened perception. So they're tremendously open. You get to know them very quickly, get to understand them. It's a sort of shared ordeal, and the sort of acquaintanceships that you make very quickly ripen into proper friendships, especially if they join the Mastermind Club, which is an exclusive club just for people who've sat in the black chair. And we meet every year for a weekend, and we have an in-house quiz, which I also am quizmaster for, and a quarterly magazine called Pass, which has got news of other members, news of other quizzes that they can enter into, and of course their own in-house quiz as well.
Okay, here we go then.
Nice and quiet again, please, everybody.
Round of applause. On floor. Magnus picked up his own cue.
I'd watched the programme for a number of years and decided that my capability was as high as any of the contestants I'd seen on the programme. So I thought, well, why not go for it?
General Wolfe was victorious. I've started, so you'll finish. General Wolfe was victorious over whom at Quebec in 1759.
Right, staying on 2 for the applause then.
Montcalm is right, and at the end of that round,
Steady
Mr.
there.
White, your score has soared into the stratosphere with 18 points.
Capture now. Call next.
I sit at home every week and do it, one after the other, with no trouble. But when you're actually sitting there doing it, surrounded by an audience, although it's blacked out, you still got that knowledge that one wrong move, and you can blow the whole thing.
Mr. White, thank you very much.
And 3.
And you can see how Martin Wyatt got on next Thursday on BBC One. At a time when some people are thought to be too old at 30 for some jobs, and early retirement is a byword, it's encouraging to hear of someone coming into their own in their 70s. Minna Keel started to compose a symphony at 71, and the BBC Symphony Orchestra gave the first performance of it on Radio 3 last month. Minna Keel was with Libby Purvis on midweek, where she talked about her beginnings.
I was born within the sound of Bow Bells. I'm a true Cockney, and my parents were Russian Jewish immigrants. Although I was born in London, I couldn't speak a word of English. When I went to school, I had to learn English. And then I got a scholarship to go to a school in Hackney, and we moved to Hackney. And in those days, moving from Wentworth Street near Petticoat Lane to Hackney was at least like moving to Bognor Regis or something like that. It was moving into the country. And then I went to this very progressive secondary school. It was called the Howard County Secondary School, Laura Place. And it was very experimental, very advanced, wonderful school.
Because you had actual music lessons at school, didn't you, which wasn't that usual?
At school, I think we were one of the very few schools that did theory of music and harmony. And I learnt up to 4-part harmony. And I wrote a hymn tune. And, I was quite convinced that it was, I was at least as good as Beethoven, having written this hymn tune.
You actually made it into the Royal Academy of Music in the end.
Yes, I had intended to go to university because I loved languages and I was fairly bright. But my father died suddenly, and I first of all went to the Royal Academy of Music because it was the only place I could travel easily and help my mother in her business. And I was going to take piano, and I had to take a second subject, so I decided to take composition. And I was very lucky. I was put with William Olwyn.
Yes.
And he was a wonderful teacher. And I immediately found that composition was really my thing and not piano at all.
Was all this exciting? I mean, you were
Very
in your late
exciting.
teens and you were finding a vocation. It must have been a tremendous time.
It was very exciting. If I may tell you what happened, my very first lesson with William Olwyn, he said, could you write me a piano piece for next week? I was so excited at the idea that he thought I could write a piano piece that I got lost in the underground for hours. I couldn't concentrate sufficiently to get out at the right station. And it was very exciting.
But the point about all this is that after 1 year, you left the Royal Academy of Music.
It was a little more than a
and
year.
stopped.
It was almost 2 years.
But you had to leave. You had to stop this whole career.
I had to stop. I was doing quite well because everything that I was composing was being played at students' concerts. The Royal Academy have fortnightly concerts. But members of my family used to say to me, how can you go on doing your music and your mother's struggling in the business? I couldn't stand the pressure, and eventually I just gave it up.
Did you resent your mother and your family for doing this?
No, I didn't. Looking back on it, I think psychologically I must have been absolutely heartbroken, but I persuaded myself I wasn't really any good anyway. And I completely turned my back on composing. I kept up piano playing almost throughout my life, but I thought I would never compose again, and I just stopped.
But she started again 46 years later. The result was her symphony, and Midweek gave us a short extract. part of 79-year-old Minna Keel's First Symphony. Cockneys, like Minna, were the subject for the first in a new series of Talk of the Town, Talk of the Country, in which Stanley Ellis examines the way we speak in various parts of the British Isles. He said he'd held off from Londoners so far because the subject is so big. There's also the problem of the North-South divide, not the countrywide one, but the line drawn by the River Thames, which separates Londoners into two camps. Perhaps you can tell which camp I dwell in from my choice of this extract from the programme.
You know, you was free to run about, go where you like, you know, you had no fears of anything. You used to go all over the place, south of London, on any trolley bus or tram.
Used to play knocking down ginger, tie a piece of cotton on the door and walk round the corner and pull it, and then people used to come out. But you don't realise how annoying it is. I mean, you do now, but I mean, when you was a kid, you didn't realise, you didn't think that was wrong.
What we used to do is to walk down to a place called the Blue House at Mitcham, get a 6:30 trolley bus into Tooting, and get the number 2 or number 4 tram right the way through to the embankment. Then pick up a 33 tram and go right out to Abbey Woods. Come back with a load of bluebells, 6 or 7 o'clock at night, absolutely knackered. You know, he'd been playing all that time, and all he had to eat was his bread and dripping sandwiches and a bottle of cold tea. Come back black as nougat's knocker. You get something to eat, you're slung in the boat, and you're in bed and you slept like the proverbial.
There was an old, very old lady, very weird, lived near in Stepney. She used to wear very dark clothes, and we used to call her Daddy Witchy. Oh, Daddy Witchy can't catch me. Who used to run for her lives. She was quite a kind lady, really, when we really found her out, you know. We found she was quite a nice lady and she loved children.
The legend of Cockney within London is a great stayer, but there's certainly one great difference from country talk that applies, and has applied for centuries, to the speech of London, that it's vigorous, outward-looking, mobile, typified by growth, variety and invention. Tom Pointing's phrase, black as nougat's knocker, I had fun with that. Newgate, I thought. Well, it may be, but from at least 1840, a Newgate knocker has been a term applied in what's called low colloquial use to a lock of hair roughly like a figure 6. Before that even, back to 1820, the description was used for soiled, dirty. All prisons seem to have been called Newgate. The original Newgate dates back to the 13th century. Oh dear, I thought it was modern slang. London speech is advanced and trailblazing too, you know, even when it's taken to extremes.
See, now look, what happens when you want to say something? You think of a thought to say up in your brain, didn't you? See? Now, a message is conveyed down all your passages, down to your vocal cords in here. And they start wobbling about like that.
Oh,
Now, them wobbling about like that throws the sound up into the mouth, what's like a loudspeaker, throws the sound out to the ear holes of the people what's listening to you. That's how your voice works.
Like the wireless.
Yeah, something like the wireless.
Only with the wireless, at least you can turn it off.
Not a luxury I'll be indulging in much over the next 7 days. You could try it, just as long as you remember to switch on again next week at the same time. Goodbye now.
That was Margaret Howard with her pick of the week. The producer was Helen Fry.